My name is Bethany Baker, and at 31 years of age, I have spent more time navigating the high-stakes adrenaline of the Level 1 Trauma Center at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta than I have navigating the emotional minefields of my own family. I am a woman who remains calm when a 2024 charcoal gray Ford F-150 is wrapped around a telephone pole and the driver's life is leaking onto the asphalt. Yet my hands were shaking as I stood in the center of the Grace Community Chapel in Millbrook, Georgia. It was exactly 5:48 a.m. on a Saturday that was supposed to be the most significant day of my life. But instead, the light of my iPhone 15 Pro Max was illuminating a digital death sentence. No daughter of mine walks down an aisle without my express permission. Come home, Bethany, or consider yourself dead to this family. The text from my father, Arthur Baker, was a cold, calculated strike, delivered with the same clinical detachment he used when signing off on manufacturing quotas at his textile mill. I stood there, surrounded by 120 empty mahogany pews, each one polished to a mirror shine that reflected the flickering light of the altar candles I had lit myself in a desperate bid for peace. The air in the chapel was thick, heavy with the cloying, sweet scent of $3,400 worth of white peonies and ranunculus, a floral arrangement that, in the pre-dawn gloom, smelled less like a celebration and more like a high-end funeral. My mother, Diane Baker, had spent the preceding 4 hours, specifically from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., executing a scorched earth campaign against my reputation. Using the leather-bound address book she kept like a weapon on her mahogany escritoire, she had called every single person on my guest list. One by one, our neighbors from the Oak Hollow subdivision, my cousins from Savannah, and lifelong family friends were told the same meticulously crafted lie. "Bethany has had a psychotic break," she had whispered into the receiver, her voice trembling with a practiced, performative grief. "The wedding is canceled for her own safety. We are devastated. She didn't just want to stop the ceremony because she disapproved of Mark, a man who worked as a public defender and didn't fit her vision of a country club son-in-law. She wanted to bury my name in the red clay of Millbrook. She wanted me broken, isolated, and forced back under her thumb, back into the role of the quiet, obedient daughter who never questioned the stifling expectations of the Baker household. I am a woman who has intubated patients in the dark and held the hands of the dying while machines shrieked their final warnings. But as I stood in that silent church, the weight of their betrayal felt like a physical pressure on my lungs. I looked at the floral arch, a masterpiece of ivory petals and eucalyptus that had cost more than my first used car, a 2012 silver Honda Civic that I'd bought with my own saved wages from the hospital. Every detail of this wedding had been paid for by my own sweat, by double shifts and holiday bonuses, specifically to ensure that my parents had no financial leverage over me. Yet, they had found a way to use the one thing I couldn't buy, the social fabric of my hometown. I walked to the back of the chapel, the heels of my bridal shoes clicking sharply against the reclaimed heart pine flooring, a sound that echoed through the hollow space like a ticking clock. My mind raced back to the thousands of dollars already spent, the $800 deposit on the artisanal catering from the Gilded Fig, the $600 for the 3-tier lemon lavender cake currently sitting in a walk-in cooler, and the $3,000 vintage lace gown hanging in the vestry. The injustice of it burned in my throat, a sharp, acidic contrast to the cool morning air. For years, I had been the shadow to my younger brother, Caleb, the golden child who could do no wrong even when he crashed his 2023 Midnight Blue BMW 5 Series into a neighbor's stone wall while under the influence. My parents had paid for his lawyers, bought the neighbor's silence, and replaced his car within a week, all while lecturing me on the necessity of modesty and saving for a rainy day when I asked for help with my nursing school textbooks. I was the one who stayed up until 3 a.m. studying by the light of a single desk lamp while they took him on European cruises. Now, as an adult, I was still being punished for my independence, for daring to choose a life and a man that didn't serve their narrative of prestige. I felt a surge of cold, hard resolve. I wasn't just a daughter, I was a trauma nurse. I was trained to assess a disaster, stabilize the patient, and find a way forward when everything was falling apart. I pulled out my phone and looked at the contact list. I didn't call my mother. I didn't call my father. I called the one person I knew would understand the gravity of a life-or-death situation. Sarah, the head nurse of the night shift at Grady. I explained the situation in the clipped professional tones of a medical report. My wedding guest list has been wiped out by a family intervention. The venue is ready, the food is paid for, and I am standing here in a dress that cost 3 months of overtime. I need people, Sarah. I need a family that shows up. Within 10 minutes, the digital grapevine of the Atlanta medical community began to hum. These were people who understood what it meant to be discarded. People who saw the worst of humanity every day and still chose to be kind. They weren't blood, but they were the people who had stood in the trenches with me during 12-hour shifts where we didn't have time to eat or use the restroom. I sat on the bottom step of the altar, watching the sun begin to bleed over the horizon, casting long amber streaks through the stained glass windows. I thought about the 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe High Country parked outside, the car Mark and I had saved for together, a symbol of our shared future. That car represented a life where I wasn't an afterthought or a doll to be manipulated. It represented the 6-figure salary I earned through sheer grit, the taxes I paid, and the mortgage on our small, sun-drenched bungalow in Cabbagetown. My parents viewed my career as a hobby until I could marry well, but to me, it was my identity. Every bruise I'd treated and every heart I'd helped restart was a testament to a strength they couldn't comprehend. At 6:15 a.m., the first car pulled into the gravel lot of the chapel. It wasn't a luxury sedan belonging to a Millbrook socialite. It was an old, battered 2015 Toyota Corolla belonging to a respiratory therapist named Mike. He walked in, still in his navy blue scrubs, holding a lukewarm cup of Waffle House coffee that cost him exactly $2.14. He looked at me, looked at the empty pews, and simply nodded. "Where do you want me, boss?" he asked. Soon, the lot began to fill. A 2022 white Jeep Grand Cherokee carrying 3 surgical residents, a Harley-Davidson motorcycle ridden by a grizzled paramedic named Lou, and a fleet of modest sedans and SUVs. These were the strangers my mother would never have invited to her dinner parties. They were the people who knew that family isn't a name on a birth certificate. It's the person who stays when the room is screaming and the floor is covered in blood. As the pews began to fill, the silence of the chapel was replaced by the low, comforting murmur of people who actually cared. I could hear the rustle of scrub suits being swapped for spare jackets left in trunks and the quiet click of a digital camera being readied by a nurse who did photography on the side. My mother had spent the night trying to isolate me, but she had underestimated the community I had built in the silence of her neglect. I looked at the front row, where my parents should have been sitting in their bespoke outfits, my father in his $4,000 Italian suit, and my mother in her silk Vera Wang mother-of-the-bride dress. They were absent, huddled in their colonial-style mansion on the hill, probably congratulating themselves on their victory over my independence. But as I watched a trauma surgeon share a laugh with a janitor in the 3rd row, I realized that their absence was the greatest gift they could have given me. The moral weight of the situation settled into my bones. Family is not defined by the DNA that runs through your veins or the permission you seek from people who only love you when you are small. Family is a choice made every single day to show up, to see the truth, and to stand in the gap when the world tries to tear you down. My name is Bethany Baker, and as I prepared to walk down that aisle, I wasn't looking for a father's approval or a mother's blessing. I was looking at a room full of people who knew exactly who I was and loved me because of it, not in spite of it. I was a woman who had spent 31 years trying to earn a seat at a table that was never meant for me, only to realize that I had the power to build my own table, with my own rules and my own people. The 200 strangers filling those seats weren't strangers at all. They were the evidence of a life well lived outside the shadow of the Baker name. The ceremony hadn't even started, but I had already won. The truth was out. The pews were full, and for the first time in 31 years, the air I was breathing felt clean, free of the suffocating scent of peonies and old, bitter lies. Real family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth finally comes out. My name is Bethany Baker, and for 31 years, I have been the involuntary audience to a play produced, directed, and starring my mother, Diane Holloway Baker. To the 8,124 residents of Millbrook, Georgia, my mother was the undisputed queen of social grace and civic duty, the woman who single-handedly orchestrated the Baptist church bake sales with the precision of a military campaign and dictated the policy of the local school board from a leather chair she treated like a throne. She moved through the aisles of our local Piggly Wiggly with a regal air, her pearls perfectly matched to her twin sets, projecting an image of a harmonious, high-achieving family that was as carefully curated as the antique porcelain figurines she kept in her lighted curios. However, behind the heavy mahogany double doors of our 4,500-square-foot colonial home on Heritage Drive, a house paid for in full by my father's quiet, decades-long compliance with her every whim, the reality was a suffocating dictatorship where privacy was a luxury I was never afforded. Until the very day I moved out at 18, my mother treated my life like a public record, routinely reading through my journals with a critical eye and even going so far as to select my socks and undergarments to ensure they met her unspoken standards of propriety. Every choice I made was a battleground, and every step toward independence was viewed as a personal insurrection against her meticulously maintained empire of appearances. The war between my reality and her curated world reached a fever pitch the moment I introduced her to Marcus. Marcus is 33, a lead carpenter for Habitat for Humanity who spends his days under the blistering Georgia sun framing houses for families who have lost everything. A man whose hands are calloused and whose heart is the sturdiest thing I have ever known. My mother hated him instantly, not because of any flaw in his character, but because he was the first person in my life who didn't look to her for permission to breathe. Marcus walked into our home wearing a clean but worn flannel shirt and work boots, smelling faintly of sawdust and cedar, and he looked Diane Holloway directly in the eye without flinching. He didn't fawn over her expensive floral arrangements or compliment the vintage 1960s silver tea service she displayed like a holy relic. The breaking point for her was a dinner she staged 3 months into our relationship, a night where her passive aggression turned into a calculated act of psychological warfare. She had invited us for a formal Sunday roast, but when we arrived, the dining table, set with her finest Waterford crystal and Wedgwood china, was conspicuously arranged with only 3 place settings. She had deliberately removed the 4th chair, forcing Marcus to stand in the hallway while she sat at the head of the table, calmly slicing a prime rib as if he didn't exist, her voice a sharp, polished blade as she discussed the upcoming Garden Club gala. It was a performance of cruelty so refined it left me breathless, yet it only solidified my resolve to build a life that was the exact opposite of hers. My life now exists in a 900-square-foot cottage on the outskirts of town, a modest space with creaky floorboards and a roof that occasionally leaks during the heavy July thunderstorms. But it is a sanctuary I bought with every cent of my own savings from the hospital. While my mother sits in her sprawling colonial mansion surrounded by expensive silence and the ghost of the daughter she tried to mold, I live in a home filled with the smell of Marcus's wood shavings and the chaotic energy of a life actually being lived. The contrast is jarring. Her house is a museum of things she owns, while mine is a collection of things I love. My father, Jerry, is the silent spectator in this conflict, a man who has spent 30 years perfecting the art of being invisible to avoid Diane's wrath. I have vivid, painful memories of being sent to bed hungry as a child because I dared to bring home a B+ on a chemistry exam instead of the expected A, a failure that Diane claimed reflected poorly on the family's intellectual standing. In the dark, quiet hours of those nights, I would hear the floorboards groan as my father crept up the stairs, sliding a smuggled peanut butter sandwich, wrapped carefully in a paper napkin to avoid crumbs, under my bedroom door. He was a man of small, secret kindnesses, yet he never once found the courage to raise his voice or stand between me and the woman who was slowly eroding my spirit. He chose his own peace over my protection, a betrayal that hurt far more than the hunger ever did. And as I stood in the chapel on my wedding morning, I realized he was still choosing that same path of least resistance. The technical specifications of our two worlds tell the story better than any emotional plea could. My mother's kitchen is equipped with a $7,000 Sub-Zero refrigerator and a professional-grade wolf range that she rarely uses for anything more complex than heating up catered hors d'oeuvres, while my small kitchen features a refurbished 2018 GE electric stove and a mismatched set of cast-iron pans I found at estate sales. Her world is built on the brand names and the price tags that signal status to the neighbors, while my world is built on the utility of objects that serve a purpose. When she saw the 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe High Country that Marcus and I had purchased, her only comment was about the lack of elegance in a utility vehicle, completely ignoring the fact that it was a symbol of our hard work and the long hours I spent at the trauma center and he spent on construction sites. She couldn't see the value in something that didn't have a luxury hood ornament or the approval of the Millbrook elite. This fundamental disconnect defined our entire relationship. She was obsessed with the frame, while I was desperately trying to paint the picture. Every interaction was filtered through her need for control, a need that led her to spend 4 hours on the phone destroying my wedding day because she couldn't stand the thought of a ceremony she didn't authorize. Standing in the chapel, the scent of those $3,400 worth of peonies, the very flowers she had insisted on because they were classic, now felt like a mockery of her influence. She had chosen the flowers, she had chosen the pews, and then she had tried to choose the guest list's absence. She lived in a world where a daughter was a possession, an asset to be managed and displayed like a piece of high-end real estate. But as the morning sun hit the stained glass, casting vibrant blues and reds across the empty floor, I felt the weight of her 4,500-square-foot prison lift off my shoulders. I was a trauma nurse who handled life and death crises with a steady hand, and I realized that my mother's curated world was nothing more than a fragile shell held together by the fear of what people might think if they saw the cracks. My father's compliance was the glue, and my silence had been the foundation. But that morning, I decided to stop being the foundation for a house that was built on my own misery. The hyper-realism of my current situation, the specific sound of the 2015 Toyota Corolla pulling into the gravel lot, the exact temperature of the lukewarm Waffle House coffee Mike was holding, and the grit of the red Georgia clay on the soles of my shoes felt more correct than any birthday party or holiday dinner I had ever attended in my parents' home. My mother's world was a series of expensive, high-definition lies, while my world was a gritty, low-budget truth. The injustice of my father's silence resonated in the hollow space of the chapel, a reminder that being nice and being good are not the same thing. He was nice when he brought the sandwiches, but he wasn't good because he allowed the cruelty to continue. My mother was neither. She was a woman who measured love in degrees of obedience and respect in terms of social standing. As I prepared to fill those pews with the strangers who were actually my family, I felt a profound sense of liberation from the 4,500 square feet of expectations that had nearly crushed me. In the end, the moral of the story isn't just about escaping a toxic parent. It's about the cost of staying. My father paid for his comfort with his daughter's happiness, and my mother paid for her reputation with her daughter's love. They were both bankrupt in ways that no amount of textile mill profits or colonial real estate could ever fix. I stood there, a 31-year-old woman who had finally stopped waiting for a permission slip to live her own life. Family isn't the people who build a fortress to keep the world out. Family is the people who help you tear down the walls so you can finally see the sun. My mother had the house, the name, and the perfect life, but I had the truth. And on that humid Georgia morning, the truth was the only thing that mattered. The 900-square-foot cottage was a palace compared to the gilded cage she called a home, and the man she tried to leave in the hallway was the only one who truly saw the woman standing at the altar. I am Bethany Baker, and I am no longer a piece of my mother's collection. I am the architect of my own destiny, and the pews were about to be filled with the witnesses of my resurrection. My name is Bethany Baker, and if my career as a trauma nurse has taught me anything, it is how to recognize the precise moment a situation turns from critical to fatal, a skill that I never imagined I would have to apply to the woman who gave me life. The betrayal that finally severed the remaining threads of my patience was not a sudden explosion of temper, but a cold, calculated strike delivered with the surgical precision of a woman who had spent decades mastering the art of psychological warfare. It happened exactly 3 weeks before my wedding day, on a Tuesday afternoon that felt deceptively normal, until my mother, Diane Holloway Baker, arrived at my home unannounced. I was sitting in my 900-square-foot cottage, resting my feet after a grueling 12-hour shift at the hospital, when she let herself in with her spare key and sat down on my $1,200 forest green velvet sofa, a piece I had purchased with my first major promotion bonus, and one that she had previously described as common. She didn't offer a greeting or ask how I was. She simply smoothed her silk skirt, looked me in the eye with a mask of manufactured pity, and told me that she had seen Marcus at a high-end bistro in the next county over, tucked into a private booth with a younger woman she didn't recognize. She described the scene in vivid, agonizing detail, noting the way he leaned in to whisper to this mystery woman, and the way they seemed to share a level of intimacy that she claimed I was clearly lacking in my own relationship. I felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that usually signals a trauma code in the ER, but instead of panic, I felt a sharp, icy clarity because I knew exactly where Marcus was at that very moment. Without a word, I pulled my iPhone 15 Pro Max from the coffee table and dialed Marcus on speakerphone, my heart hammering against my ribs not out of doubt for him, but out of a dawning horror at the depth of my mother's depravity. The call connected on the second ring, and the background noise wasn't the clink of silverware or the murmur of a romantic bistro, but the hollow, echoing acoustics of a church hall. Marcus's voice came through crisp and steady, explaining that he was currently in the middle of a formal board meeting for Habitat for Humanity, seated directly across from Pastor Miller and 12 other witnesses, including 2 city council members and a local architect. He was discussing the blueprints for a new low-income housing project, a fact that was immediately verified by the pastor's booming greeting in the background. My mother sat there, inches away from the phone, and she didn't blink, she didn't blush, and she certainly didn't apologize. She simply stood up with the poise of a seasoned diplomat, smoothed her perfectly coiffed hair, and said, "Perhaps I was mistaken. The lighting in those places is always so dim," before walking out the door without another word. That was the exact moment I realized that Diane Holloway was no longer just a difficult, controlling mother. She was a dangerous woman who was willing to fabricate a world-shattering lie just to see if she could still pull the strings of my emotional stability. However, the failed attempt at character assassination was only the opening salvo in her campaign to sabotage my wedding from the inside out, piece by piece, like a silent predator dismantling its prey. In the days that followed, I began to receive frantic calls from my carefully selected vendors, revealing a trail of digital and telephonic breadcrumbs that led directly back to her Heritage Drive colonial. She had contacted my florist, attempting to use her status as the mother of the bride to override my order of white peonies and ranunculus, insisting that they be replaced with massive arrangements of stargazer lilies. She knew with absolute certainty that I am deathly allergic to lilies, a fact established during a childhood emergency room visit that had nearly ended in respiratory failure, yet she was willing to risk my life just to ensure the aesthetic of the day matched her personal preference for stately blooms. It wasn't an accident. It was an attempted poisoning masked as a floral upgrade, a move so cold-blooded it made my blood run like ice water through my veins. The sabotage didn't stop at the flowers. She moved on to the technical and logistical aspects of the ceremony with a relentless, petty efficiency that was breathtaking in its cruelty. She called my photographer, a talented professional I was paying $4,000 to capture the day, and attempted to cancel the contract for the second shooter, claiming it was an unnecessary expense and that the family wanted to save money. She didn't care that a single shooter couldn't possibly cover both the bridal preparations and the groom's arrival. She simply wanted to ensure that the record of my joy was as diminished and fragmented as possible. She reached out to the artisanal catering team at the Gilded Fig, questioning the quality of the ingredients and suggesting that the lemon lavender cake, a 3-tier masterpiece I had spent $600 on, was too adventurous for our local Millbrook palate, recommending instead a dry, traditional fruitcake that no one under the age of 80 actually enjoys. Every move she made was designed to strip away my agency, to replace my choices with her own, and to create a version of the wedding that felt less like a celebration of love and more like a staged production of her own social dominance. I spent my breaks at the hospital tucked into the nurse's station, huddled over my phone as I reconfirmed every single detail of my own wedding, placing passwords on every account and warning my vendors that any communication not coming directly from my verified email address was to be disregarded. I felt like I was fortifying a bunker rather than planning a party. The contrast between my professional life, where I was trusted with the titration of life-saving medications and the management of multi-organ failure, and my personal life, where I had to defend myself against my own mother's attempts to induce an anaphylactic shock on my wedding day, was a gap so wide it felt like a canyon. I began to see her not as a parent, but as a hostile entity, a woman who viewed my happiness as a direct threat to her own relevance. My father, Jerry, remained his usual ghost-like self during this period, offering no resistance when she spent hours on her landline coordinating these adjustments. I could see him through the window of their home when I went to pick up some old boxes, sitting in his armchair with the evening news turned up to a deafening volume, a man who had traded his daughter's safety for a quiet life with a monster. The financial reality of her interference was equally galling. She was trying to save me money on a wedding she hadn't contributed a single cent toward, acting as the executor of a budget she had no part in creating. My savings, the $85,000 annual salary I earned through trauma certifications and overnight differentials, were being treated like a communal pool she could drain at will. She viewed my independence as a clerical error that needed to be corrected. Every time I thwarted one of her attempts, securing the second shooter back onto the contract or reconfirming the peony order with the florist, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction, but also a growing exhaustion. I was 31 years old, a woman who had seen the worst the world could do in the trauma bays of Atlanta, yet I was being hunted by the person who was supposed to be my primary protector. The hyper-realism of this period is etched into my mind with agonizing clarity. The specific, cloying scent of the lilies she tried to force upon me, the exact font on the emails from the photographer asking for clarification on the cancellation, and the way the forest green velvet of my sofa felt beneath my fingertips as I listened to her lie about the man I loved. These weren't just wedding mishaps. They were the symptoms of a profound and malignant narcissism that had finally reached its terminal stage. I realized then that there would be no reconciliation, no hallmark moment where she would see me as an equal. To her, I was an asset that had gone rogue, and she was determined to liquidate me before I could prove that I didn't need her. As the 3-week countdown to the wedding began, the chapel wasn't just a place for a ceremony, it was becoming a sanctuary where I hoped to finally lock the doors against her influence. The moral of this chapter of my life is a bitter one. Some people do not want to be part of your joy. They want to be the reason for its absence. My mother didn't want a beautiful wedding for her daughter. She wanted a public display of her own power, and if she couldn't have that, she was perfectly content to see the entire event collapse under the weight of her lies and my potential allergic reactions. She was a woman who would rather see me in a casket surrounded by lilies than in a bridal gown surrounded by peonies of my own choosing. Standing in that quiet chapel at 5:48 a.m., Looking at the pews she had tried to empty and the flowers she had tried to weaponize, I knew that the battle was no longer about a wedding. It was about survival. It was about the fact that family isn't the people who share your medical history. It's the people who don't try to turn your history into a tragedy. The truth was out, the lines were drawn, and as the strangers from the hospital began to fill the seats, I knew that Diane Holloway Baker had finally run out of moves. The game was over, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one who was going to be broken. It was exactly 9:15 p.m. on a Tuesday, and I was sitting in the driver's seat of my 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe High Country, the engine idling with a low, rhythmic hum that felt like the only steady thing in my world. Outside, a torrential Georgia rain was lashing against the windshield, the heavy drops blurring the suburban landscape into a smear of gray and charcoal. I had just finished a brutal 14-hour shift in the trauma center, a day defined by a multi-car pileup on I-85 that had pushed every one of us to the absolute brink of our physical and emotional endurance. My scrubs were wrinkled, my hair was matted from the humidity, and when I lifted my hands to wipe the condensation from the side window, I saw them. They were shaking, a fine, uncontrollable tremor that had nothing to do with the physical exhaustion of performing chest compressions and everything to do with the psychological siege my mother was conducting against my life. In the silence of that darkened driveway, surrounded by the scent of expensive leather and the faint, lingering metallic tang of the hospital that always seemed to cling to my skin, I had a moment of terrifyingly clear clinical realization. I realized that if I allowed Diane Holloway Baker to win this war, if I surrendered to her sabotage and her curated lies, I wouldn't just be losing a wedding ceremony or a deposit on a floral arrangement. I would lose Marcus, the only man who had ever looked at me and seen a human being instead of a social accessory. I would lose my mental and physical health to the constant, grinding friction of her narcissism, and eventually, I would lose any future children I might have to the same cycle of manipulation and emotional starvation that had defined my own upbringing. The rain continued to hammer against the roof of the Tahoe, sounding like 1,000 tiny fingers tapping for entry. But I felt a sudden, icy resolve settle over me, the kind of cold, analytical detachment I usually reserved for triage during a mass casualty event. I reached into the passenger seat and pulled out a yellow legal pad and a black Pilot G2 pen from my nursing bag, and right there, by the dim glow of the dome light, I drew a single, sharp, vertical line down the middle of the first page. On the left side, I wrote column A, the legacy list, which was comprised of my mother's friends, the socialites, the board members, the country club regulars who only knew me as the Baker girl, who occasionally made the local news for her academic achievements, but mostly served as a prop for Diane's Christmas cards. On the right side, I wrote column B, the real list, and beneath that heading, I began to list the names of my people, the ones who had seen me at my worst and stayed anyway. I saw the names of the nurses who had traded shifts with me so I could attend my dress fittings, the paramedics who shared 30-cent vending machine crackers with me at 3 a.m., the construction crew members who worked alongside Marcus and treated me like a sister, and even a few former patients whose lives I had touched and who had, in turn, reminded me why I chose this grueling profession in the first place. I didn't hesitate. I picked up my phone and dialed Margot, my best friend since we were 6 years old, and now a senior social worker who navigated the foster care system with the cold-blooded precision of a sniper and the heart of a saint. When she picked up, I didn't waste time with pleasantries or explanations because she had already been the recipient of my midnight vents about the stargazer lilies and the canceled second shooter. "Activate the backup," I said, my voice sounding steadier than my hands. Margot didn't even ask for a reason. She simply let out a long, slow breath, and I could almost hear her grabbing her own laptop on the other end of the line. We spent the next 14 days working in the shadows of my mother's ongoing campaign, building what we called the Ghost Guest List, a comprehensive roster of 200 people who actually knew the real Bethany Baker. These weren't people who cared about the prestige of the Baker family name or the thread count of the linens. These were people who understood the value of a person's character and the necessity of showing up when the world tries to shut you out. We coordinated through encrypted group chats and private emails, ensuring that not a single word of our counter-operation reached the Heritage Drive Colonial or my mother's network of spies at the Baptist Church. The technical execution of this plan was as detailed as any surgical pre-op. Margot and I tracked the costs, the logistics, and the seating charts on a shared spreadsheet, ensuring that we had enough food and drink to accommodate an entirely different crowd than the one my mother was currently busy uninviting. I looked at the names on my real list and saw a tapestry of a life well lived. There was Elena, a single mother whose son I had stabilized after an asthma attack 3 years ago and who had sent me a hand-knit blanket as a thank you. There was Captain Miller from the fire department, who had stood by me during more trauma codes than I could count. And there was Marcus's entire framing crew, men who smelled of cedar and sweat and who would walk through fire for him. This was my true inheritance, a community built not on the fragile foundation of social standing, but on the solid rock of mutual respect and shared struggle. Meanwhile, I watched as my mother continued her public performance, telling the Millbrook elite that I was unstable and confused, all while she likely began planning a quiet, controlled recovery brunch that would serve as my social funeral. She was so blinded by her own need for dominance that she couldn't see the army I was gathering in the silence she had created. The contrast between our two worlds was never more apparent than during those 14 days of clandestine planning. While my mother was likely debating the merits of different silver patterns and worrying about the optics of my supposed breakdown, I was calculating the logistics of transporting 200 people from Atlanta to Millbrook on short notice. I was coordinating with a local shuttle service, paying an extra $500 rush fee out of my own pocket to ensure that my coworkers wouldn't have to worry about the drive after their shifts. Every dollar I spent was a declaration of independence, a physical manifestation of the fact that my life belonged to me and no one else. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction every time I crossed a name off the legacy list and added a new one to the real list, knowing that each replacement was a nail in the coffin of my mother's control. My father, Jerry, remained in the background of this entire operation, a silent ghost in his own home, likely noticing the tension radiating from Diane but too afraid to ask what was happening. He was the man who had let me go to bed hungry for a B+, and now he was the man who was letting his wife destroy his daughter's reputation without a single word of protest. His silence was a specific kind of betrayal, a hollow space where a father's protection should have been, and it only fueled my fire to ensure that the pews would be filled with people who knew how to speak up. The atmosphere in my 900-square-foot cottage during those 2 weeks was electric, filled with the hum of laptops, the rustle of the yellow legal pad pages, and the constant, reassuring presence of Marcus, who didn't care about the drama, but cared deeply about the woman standing at the center of it. He would bring me cups of tea and remind me to eat, his presence a sturdy anchor in the storm my mother had created. We were building something together that was more than just a wedding. We were building a boundary that would never be crossed again. I thought about the 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe High Country parked in the driveway, a vehicle designed for durability and protection, and I realized it was the perfect metaphor for the life I was now claiming. I wasn't a fragile doll to be broken. I was a woman built for the long haul, for the rough terrain, and for the survival of the people I loved. The hyper-realism of the preparation, the exact weight of the legal pad, the specific black ink of the Pilot G2 pen, and the way the rain sounded on the roof of the Tahoe all became part of the sensory map of my liberation. As the wedding day approached, the ghost guest list was finalized, 200 names of people who were ready to stand in the gap. My mother thought she had emptied the church, but in reality, she had only cleared the way for the people who actually mattered. She had spent her life trying to curate a perfect world, but she had failed to realize that perfection is a brittle, fragile thing, whereas reality, messy, loud, scrub-wearing, sawdust-scented reality, is unbreakable. The moral of this transition was clear. You cannot control a person who has decided they no longer need your approval, and you certainly cannot defeat a person who has replaced your fake legacy with a real community. Standing in that chapel at 5:48 a.m. on the morning of the wedding, looking at the text from my father that told me to consider myself dead to the family, I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt more alive than I ever had in the 4,500 square foot colonial I grew up in. The pews were empty for now, but I knew that within the hour the strangers would arrive, and they would bring with them a truth that my mother's lies could never extinguish. The war was far from over, but as I looked at the yellow legal pad one last time before tucking it away, I knew I had already won the most important battle. I was Bethany Baker, and for the first time in 31 years, I wasn't asking for permission. I was giving it to myself. Family isn't the people who demand your silence to protect their image. Family is the people who give you a voice when the world tries to take it away. My name is Bethany Baker, and while my mother believed she was the grand architect of my social demise, she failed to realize that a trauma nurse and a senior social worker are perhaps the two most dangerous people to underestimate when it comes to logistical warfare and crisis management. The centerpiece of our counteroffensive was what Margot affectionately termed the arsenal, which was in reality a heavily encrypted, multi-tabbed Google spreadsheet that served as the nerve center for our operation to reclaim my wedding day. While Diane Holloway Baker was likely sitting at her antique mahogany kitchen table in Millbrook, clutching a cheap $1.20 ballpoint pen as she gleefully drew thick, ink-heavy lines through the names of my friends and colleagues on the original guest list, Margot and I were working in a digital fortress. We were sending out secure, personalized, save-the-date text messages and calendar invites to the 200 people who actually mattered. The people from Column B who had seen me through double shifts, grief, and the quiet struggles of building a life outside my mother's shadow. Every single entry in the arsenal was cross-referenced with a confirmation code, and we managed the entire guest list with a level of security usually reserved for high-level government clearance or sensitive medical records. I didn't stop at just securing the guest list. I went on a total lockdown of every technical and financial aspect of the ceremony to prevent my mother from further sabotaging the day from the inside out. I spent 3 hours one evening calling every single vendor, from the florist providing the $3,400 worth of white peonies to the artisanal baker who was finishing the lemon lavender cake, and established a mandatory 4-digit password on every account. I explicitly informed them that no changes, cancellations, or upgrades were to be authorized unless that specific code was provided, effectively neutralizing my mother's ability to swap my flowers for the lilies that would send me into anaphylactic shock. To ensure the physical security of the Grace Community Chapel, I went as far as hiring a private security guard named Ray, a retired sheriff's deputy who agreed to stand at the church door for $50 an hour. Ray was a man with a gaze like a cold steel blade and a 2022 silver Chevrolet Silverado 1500 parked in the gravel lot. And he was the one who would ensure that the guest list my mother had spent her nights uninviting would never be allowed to cross the threshold of the chapel. He was there to protect my peace, and he was a physical barrier between my happiness and my mother's need for control. The most profound move in our tactical preparation, however, was not the passwords or the security guard. It was the inclusion of my Uncle Dean, the black sheep, who my mother had exiled from our family 10 years ago after he dared to call out her manipulative behavior at a Thanksgiving dinner. Uncle Dean had lived in Savannah, Georgia for a decade, a successful landscape architect with a sharp, dry wit and a 2023 forest green Ford F-25. Oh, that he drove with the pride of a man who had built his own empire. I personally paid the $485 for his last-minute flight to Millbrook because his presence at that altar was more than just a family reunion. It was a living, breathing testament to the fact that you can survive my mother's rejection and thrive on the other side. Uncle Dean arrived at the chapel with a weathered leather suitcase and a look of grim satisfaction, ready to stand in the gap that my father, Jerry, had left empty through his decades of silent compliance. We spent hours in the vestry of the church, gathered around a laptop, compiling every single piece of psychological ammunition Diane had sent my way during the 2-week countdown to the wedding. We meticulously gathered every nasty, condescending text message my father had sent at my mother's behest, every lie she had spread to the neighbors about my supposed mental health crisis and psychotic break, and every single unauthorized vendor change she had tried to force through the phone. We organized all of these digital breadcrumbs into a single encrypted folder titled Evidence, a file that served as our insurance policy against the narrative she was trying to spin. This wasn't just a wedding prep folder. It was a record of a woman who had systematically tried to destroy her daughter's reputation because she couldn't own her. Every time my phone buzzed with another passive-aggressive message about the baker's reputation, I simply dragged the screenshot into the evidence folder, feeling a sense of cold, clinical detachment that only a trauma nurse can truly appreciate. I was treating my relationship with my mother like a crime scene, documenting the injuries and the attempts at further harm, while the 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe High Country sat in the driveway, its high-definition cameras recording the silence of the street as we worked late into the night. The technical specifications of our arsenal was a masterpiece of organizational defiance. Tab 1 was the real list of 200 people. Tab 2 was the vendor password log. Tab 3 was the security brief for Ray. And Tab 4 was the evidence tracker. While my mother was likely debating the aesthetics of the canceled wedding she had staged for the Millbrook elite, I was calculating the logistics of the lemon lavender cake's delivery and the shuttle schedule for my fellow nurses from Grady. The contrast was staggering. Her weapon was a $1.20 ballpoint pen and a lifetime of social manipulation, while mine was a data-driven, secure operation built on the foundation of genuine community and professional-grade security. I felt like a general preparing for the most important battle of my life, a battle where the stakes were not just a ceremony, but my right to exist as an independent woman. Uncle Dean's presence was a constant reminder of the cost of staying silent. He had lost a decade of family connections because he refused to lie, and I was determined not to let another year go by in the shadow of my mother's colonial mansion. Standing in the chapel at 5:48 a.m., looking at the empty pews and the text from my father that told me to consider myself dead to the family, I realized that the arsenal hadn't just protected my wedding. It had protected my future. I wasn't just Bethany Baker, the daughter who was having a breakdown. I was Bethany Baker, the woman who had built a digital and physical fortress around her joy. The scent of the white peonies, the very ones Diane had tried to replace with lilies, was a sweet, fragrant victory that filled the space where her influence used to be. Every detail was exactly as I had planned it, from the 4-digit passwords that kept the vendors in line to the $50 an hour I was paying Ray to guard the door. I had spent 31 years trying to find a place in a story my mother was writing, but in the silence of that pre-dawn morning, I realized that I was the one who held the pen. I was the one who had written the arsenal, and I was the one who was about to fill those pews with the 200 strangers who were actually the family I had chosen for myself. The moral of this chapter of my life is that you cannot destroy a person who has kept the receipts. My mother had spent decades using the baker reputation as a weapon, but she had failed to realize that in the age of digital documentation and encrypted spreadsheets, a lie can only travel so far before it hits a wall of hard evidence. I was no longer a victim of her manipulation. I was a curator of the truth, and I had the evidence folder to prove it. As the sun began to rise over the Georgia hills, casting long, golden shadows across the mahogany pews, I felt a sense of peace that was deeper than any I had ever known. The 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe High Country was parked outside, a symbol of the durability and the strength I had found in myself. And Uncle Dean was sitting in the back row, his presence a quiet, powerful defiance of the woman who had tried to erase him. My mother had the mansion, the name, and the perfect family, but I had the arsenal, the truth, and the people who actually loved me. The battle was nearly over, and for the first time in my life I wasn't afraid of the outcome because I knew that whatever happened next, it would be on my terms, in my voice, and under my own authority. The pews were about to be filled, the security guard was at the door, and the evidence was locked in a digital vault that my mother would never be able to crack. I was Bethany Baker, and the story I was telling was finally my own. My name is Bethany Baker, and at exactly 8 a.m. on the morning of my wedding, the Grace Community Chapel in Millbrook, Georgia, was a hollow, echoing monument to my mother's cruelty. I stood in the small, cramped vestry, the air smelling of furniture polish and the faint metallic scent of the industrial steamer I had used to press the $3,000 vintage lace gown that now draped over my frame like a shroud of defiance. I looked through the heavy oak door's iron-grated window and saw a ghost town of my mother's making. 120 mahogany pews sat in perfect, agonizing rows, and not a single human soul occupied them. The silence was so absolute, it felt like a physical weight on my chest, a vacuum created by Diane Holloway Baker's 4-hour telephonic massacre of my reputation. She had succeeded in her scorched earth campaign, or at least that was the narrative she was likely celebrating at that very moment in her 4,500-square-foot colonial mansion on Heritage Drive. I could almost see her, sitting in her breakfast nook bathed in the soft morning light, sipping a cup of Earl Grey tea from a hand-painted bone china cup that cost $80, checking her watch with a smug, practiced patience as she waited for me to break, to crawl back to her doorstep, and to beg for her forgiveness for the crime of wanting a life of my own. But my mother had spent 31 years looking at me and seeing only a reflection of her own shadow, and that fundamental miscalculation was about to become the greatest tactical error of her life. At precisely 8:15 a.m., the heavy silence of the Millbrook morning was shattered by the distinct rattling roar of a 2018 white Ford Transit catering van pulling into the gravel lot with a spray of gray stones. It was Ruth Peaton, a woman whose son I had cared for in the ICU for 6 grueling weeks following a motorcycle accident that should have claimed his life. Ruth didn't come with the artisanal silver platter hors d'oeuvres my mother had tried to sabotage. She stepped out of that van wearing a bright yellow Sunday dress and hauling industrial-sized warmers filled with $2,000 worth of the finest buttermilk fried chicken, collard greens, and 5 cheese mac and black-peppered brisket she had prepared for free. She was followed by her 2 nephews, who carried gallon after gallon of sweet tea that smelled of real cane sugar and fresh mint, a grassroots feast that stood in stark contrast to the sterile, joyless world my mother inhabited. Ruth caught my eye through the window, gave a sharp, knowing nod, and began setting up her spread in the fellowship hall with the efficiency of a woman who knew exactly what it meant to fight for the people you love. Then, as if a signal had been sent across the state line, the army truly began to arrive, and the ghost town was colonized by a force of nature my mother couldn't even begin to comprehend. At 8:30 a.m., a fleet of practical, hard-working vehicles, a 2022 silver Honda CR-V, a 2019 blue Toyota RAV4, and a 2023 slate gray Subaru Forester, filled the first dozen spots in the lot. Out stepped 14 trauma nurses from Grady Memorial, women I had stood shoulder to shoulder with during mass casualty events and 12-hour shifts where the floor was slick with the cost of human fragility. They weren't wearing the muted, appropriate pastels Diane would have demanded. They were dressed in vibrant floral prints and bold jewel tones, their faces lit with a fierce, protective joy. They didn't come empty-handed either. They marched into the chapel carrying a massive, stunningly beautiful hybrid bouquet they had spent the night constructing in the hospital break room. It was a masterpiece of defiance, woven from high-quality hospital silk flowers and 24 deep red roses they had chipped in to buy, a floral arrangement that represented the blending of my professional world with my personal rebirth. They surrounded me in the vestry, the scent of their perfume and the rustle of their dresses creating a buffer of warmth that finally drove the chill of my mother's influence from the room. By 9:30 a.m., the transformation of the Grace Community Chapel was complete, and the logistical miracle of the arsenal was on full display for anyone who cared to look. The gravel parking lot was not just full, It was overflowing onto the grass of the neighboring lot, a sea of over 200 vehicles that represented every walk of life except the one my mother occupied. Inside, the mahogany pews were no longer a ghost town. They were packed with 212 people who filled the space with a low, vibrating hum of conversation and laughter. I peered out one last time and saw Marcus's entire framing crew, 20 men in their best Sunday suits with hands scarred by labor, sitting beside the respiratory therapists and the surgical residents I worked with every day. I saw Uncle Dean, his 2023 forest green Ford F250 parked prominently near the entrance, sitting in the front row where my father should have been, his presence a silent middle finger to the decade of exile my mother had forced upon him. Ray, the $50 an hour security guard, stood at the back door with his arms crossed over his chest, a living barrier that ensured not a single one of my mother's legacy list spies could enter to witness the beautiful, chaotic reality of my triumph. The atmosphere in the room was electric, a sharp, crystalline contrast to the suffocating, curated air of the Heritage Drive Colonial. For the first time in 31 years, the oxygen I was breathing felt clean, stripped of the cloying funerary scent of those $3,400 worth of peonies Diane had used as a psychological weapon. Instead, the air smelled of Ruth's fried chicken, the faint wood smoke clinging to Marcus's friends, and the honest, unvarnished scent of 200 people who actually wanted to be there. Not a single person from my mother's inner circle was present. There were no Baptist church board members, no country club socialites, and no old family friends who had participated in the silent shunning of the Baker daughter. My mother had succeeded in emptying the pews of her people, but in doing so, she had inadvertently cleared the stage for mine. She had tried to create a vacuum of isolation, but she had forgotten that a vacuum always pulls in whatever is strongest, and what was strongest in my life was the community I had built while she was busy polishing her silver. The hyper-realism of that moment is something I will carry in my marrow until the day I die. The specific, rhythmic crunch of gravel under tires as more cars arrived, the exact shade of the Grady blue scrubs one of the residents had forgotten to change out of completely, and the way the morning sun hit the 212 faces in the pews, turning the chapel into a kaleidoscope of genuine human connection. My mother's plan had relied on the assumption that without her, I was nothing. She believed that if she withdrew her social currency, I would be bankrupt. But as I watched a paramedic share a hymnal with a landscape architect from Savannah, I realized that I was the wealthiest person in Millbrook. My mother's world was built on the fragile, temporary permission of others, a house of cards that required constant maintenance and the suppression of the truth. My world was built on the foundation of the things I had done when no one was watching, the lives I had saved, the hands I had held, and the boundaries I had finally learned to draw in the red Georgia clay. I looked down at the yellow legal pad one last time before Margot tucked it into her purse, the black ink of the real list, now a living, breathing assembly of souls. The injustice of my father's 5:48 a.m. text message, the declaration that I was dead to the family, now seemed like a pathetic, small-minded attempt to hold on to a power that had already evaporated. He was sitting in a quiet house with a woman who loved her reputation more than her child, while I was standing in a room full of people who had crossed counties and skipped shifts just to make sure I wasn't alone. The contrast between the silent, Earl Grey-scented misery of my parents' home and the loud, sweet tea-scented vibrance of the chapel was the final verdict in the case of Baker versus Baker. I am Bethany Baker, and I am no longer defined by the permission I didn't receive or the guests who didn't show up. I am defined by the 212 strangers who saw a woman in trouble and decided that she was worth the drive. The moral of this moment is that the people who try to bury you often forget that you are a seed, and the very dirt they throw on your name is exactly what you need to grow. My mother thought she was burying my reputation, but she was actually planting the forest that would eventually protect me from her. As the organist, a friend of a friend who had agreed to play for $100 and a plate of Ruth's chicken, began the first notes of the processional, I felt a surge of strength that moved through me like a physical force. I wasn't walking down an aisle. I was walking out of a prison. I wasn't looking for my father to give me away because I had already taken myself back. The air was clean, the pews were full, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the baker girl or the psychotic break or the doll. I was a woman, a nurse, a wife-to-be, and a survivor. The 212 people in that room were my evidence, my army, and my future. My name is Bethany Baker, and as the doors opened to reveal the sun-drenched sanctuary, I realized that family isn't the people who share your blood. Family is the people who show up with fried chicken and silk roses when the world says you're better off dead. This was my resurrection, and the pews were exactly as they were meant to be, full of life, full of truth, and completely, beautifully free of Diane Holloway Baker. My name is Bethany Baker, and at exactly 10 a.m. on a humid Georgia Saturday, the execution of my independence was not a shouting match on a manicured lawn or a dramatic confrontation in a colonial foyer. It was a slow, deliberate walk down the center aisle of the Grace Community Chapel. The air in the sanctuary was no longer stagnant or cloying with the scent of my mother's manipulative floral choices, but was instead vibrating with the first deep, resonant chords of the pipe organ, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundation of the mahogany pews and the heart pine floors. I stood at the threshold of the double oak doors, my fingers trembling only slightly as I adjusted the heavy ivory lace of my $3,000 vintage gown, a garment I had paid for with 400 hours of overtime at the Grady Memorial Trauma Center. Beside me stood Uncle Dean, the man my mother had tried to erase from our family history 10 years ago for the crime of telling the truth, looking steady and resolute in a charcoal gray wool suit that was perhaps a half size too large in the shoulders, but carried the dignity of a man who had survived the Baker family's emotional winter. He didn't offer me a platitude or a scripted blessing. He simply reached out, tucked my arm firmly into the crook of his elbow, and gave my hand a squeeze that communicated more than 3 decades of my father's silent compliance ever could. As we crossed the threshold and began the long walk toward the altar, the 212 guests, the army of nurses, paramedics, former patients, and construction workers, rose in a singular, fluid wave of support that hit me like a physical wall of heat. These were not the socialites of Millbrook or the board members of the Baptist Church who viewed my existence as a metric for my mother's success. These were people whose lives I had touched in the quiet, blood-stained hours of the night shift, people who had seen me at my most exhausted and most human. I looked at the pews and saw Mike, the respiratory therapist, leaning forward with a look of fierce pride. I saw Ruth Peaton, who had provided $2,000 worth of catering for free, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. And I saw the 14 nurses from the trauma unit, their floral dresses a riot of color that stood in open defiance of the funeral my mother had tried to stage for my reputation. The collective energy of the room was a living thing, a powerful, protective aura that completely neutralized the 4,500 square foot shadow of the house on Heritage Drive. Marcus was standing at the altar, looking at me with an intensity that made the rest of the world fade into a blurry, inconsequential background. He was wearing a sharp, navy blue suit that contrasted with the rugged, sawdust-covered version of the man I saw every evening, and his eyes were visibly red, shimmering with a raw, unashamed emotion as he watched me approach. To him, I wasn't a psychotic break or a disobedient daughter or a social asset to be managed. I was the only thing that mattered in the world, a partner he had chosen because of my strength, not in spite of it. As I reached the front of the chapel, my iPhone 15 Pro Max, tucked into a hidden pocket of my dress, began to vibrate rhythmically against my hip, a frantic, desperate buzzing that I knew was a barrage of "come home" and "this is your last chance" text messages from my father, Arthur. Even in the final moments, they were trying to pull the leash, trying to use the digital tether of the family name to drag me back into the silent prison of their expectations. Without breaking eye contact with Marcus, I reached into the lace, pulled out the glowing device and handed it to Margot, who was standing as my maid of honor with the clinical focus of a sniper. "Block them both," I whispered, my voice steady and devoid of the hesitation that had defined my first 30 years of life. Margot took the phone with a sharp, satisfied nod, her thumbs moving with practiced efficiency as she executed the final severance of my parents' authority over my peace of mind. As she tucked the silenced device away, the minister began the ceremony, his voice booming through the rafters of the chapel, and for the first time in my life, I felt the weight of the Baker legacy simply dissolve. We said our vows in front of a crowd that Diane Holloway Baker didn't even know existed, a community of strangers who were more my family than the people who shared my DNA. I spoke my promises to Marcus with a clarity that came from knowing exactly what I was leaving behind and exactly what I was building. Every word was a brick in the foundation of a new life, one where the technical specifications were defined by honesty, mutual respect, and the freedom to fail without being erased. I thought about the 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe High Country parked outside and the 900-square-foot cottage that was waiting for us, and I realized that my mother's curated world was a fragile, hollow shell compared to the dense, vibrant reality of the love filling this room. The hyper-realism of the moment was overwhelming. The exact way the sunlight caught the dust motes dancing in the air above the altar, the faint scent of the lemon lavender cake drifting in from the fellowship hall, and the specific, grounding pressure of Marcus's calloused hands as he took mine. This wasn't a performance for the Millbrook elite. This was a surgical extraction of my soul from a toxic environment. As Marcus slid the wedding band onto my finger, a simple, elegant gold band that cost a fraction of what my mother would have spent on a prestige ring, I felt the final connection to Heritage Drive snap. I was no longer an asset to be managed or a doll to be broken. I was a woman who had saved lives and had finally saved her own. My father's silence over the decades was a debt that had finally come due, and the payment was his absence from the most important day of my life. He had chosen my mother's peace over my protection, and now he was left with that peace in a 4,500-square-foot tomb, while I was surrounded by the noise and heat of a life fully lived. The moral of this execution is that you cannot hold a person hostage to a reputation they no longer value. My mother believed that by destroying my name in Millbrook, she could force me to return to the only world she thought I had. She didn't understand that I had been building a second world in the shadows, a world populated by people who didn't care about the Baptist bake sales or the school board or the Baker name. She had emptied the pews of the people who would judge me, only to have them filled by the people who would carry me. As the minister pronounced us husband and wife, a roar of genuine, unbridled cheering erupted from the 212 guests, a sound so loud and honest it probably could have been heard all the way to the Heritage Drive Colonial. I turned to walk back down the aisle, not as a victim of a family feud, but as a victor in a war of independence. I am Bethany Baker, and as I walked out of that chapel into the bright, uncompromising Georgia sun, I realized that family is not a matter of permission. It is a matter of presence. My parents were absent because they chose the lie of control over the truth of connection, but the seats were full because I had chosen the truth over the lie. We climbed into our Tahoe, the gravel crunching under the tires like the breaking of old bones, and I didn't look back at the church or the town that had tried to define me. I looked at the man beside me and the road ahead, knowing that the evidence folder was locked, the numbers were blocked, and the life I was about to live was entirely, beautifully my own. The air was clean, the debt was settled, and for the first time in 31 years, the only voice in my head was my own, and it was telling me that I was finally home. Real family isn't blood. Family is who stands up in a wave of heat when the rest of the world tells you to sit down and be quiet. The execution was complete, and the only thing that had died was the version of me that lived for their approval. My name is Bethany Baker, and the silence that followed my wedding day was not the hollow, aching quiet of abandonment, but the dense, heavy, and profoundly peaceful silence of a hard-won victory. In the world of Diane Holloway Baker, the Sunday following a major social event was always reserved for the reconciliation brunch, a meticulously staged performance of family unity where we were expected to sit around a table draped in $1,500 Belgian linens and pretend that the previous week's psychological warfare had never occurred. I knew with the clinical certainty of a nurse monitoring a flatlining EKG that my mother was sitting in her 4,500-square-foot colonial on Heritage Drive, the silver warming trays filled with quiche and the chilled carafes of mimosas standing ready for a daughter who was never coming back. I didn't call to cancel, and I didn't send a polite text of excuse because those were the tools of the old Bethany, the one who still believed that if she were just a little more agreeable, she could earn the love she was naturally owed. Instead, at exactly 11 a.m., while the church bells of Millbrook were ringing for the morning service, I sat at the small, reclaimed wood desk in my 900-square-foot cottage and executed the final technical maneuver of my liberation. I sent a single formal email to both of my parents' private addresses, a digital severance package that contained no emotional pleas, no tears, and no room for negotiation. Attached to that email was a single high-resolution PDF titled Final Accounting and Evidence, which contained the meticulously logged record of the 120 phone calls my mother had made between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. to systematically dismantle my guest list. Alongside the call logs, I included a digitized invoice for the $1,500 in non-refundable deposits for the second photographer, the artisanal catering adjustments, and the floral security fees, costs she had tried to waste or manipulate under the guise of saving money. The email was brief, written with the cold, professional detachment I used when documenting a patient's permanent discharge. Any and all future communication regarding financial matters, property, or personal contact will henceforth be filtered through my legal counsel. Do not attempt to visit my residence or my place of employment at Grady Memorial Hospital. I hit send with a steady finger, watching the status bar complete its journey, and as the message sent notification flickered on my screen, I felt a 31-year-old weight lift off my spine, replaced by a spine of steel that Diane Holloway could never bend again. The financial and social fallout for my parents was total and absolute within the small, gossipy ecosystem of Millbrook, Georgia. Because my army of 212 people, the nurses, the paramedics, the construction crews, and my exiled Uncle Dean, had seen the reality of the wedding, the lie of my psychotic break began to disintegrate in real time. My mother's reputation, the very thing she had tried to protect by burying mine, became a liability as the story of the peony wedding spread through the town. People began to ask why a mother would try to swap her daughter's wedding flowers for lilies she knew were a lethal allergen, and why a father would send a text message at 5:48 a.m. telling his only daughter she was dead to the family. They were left sitting in that sprawling, silent mansion with 4,500 square feet of empty rooms and a daughter who had effectively become a ghost, not through her own disappearance, but through their own exclusion. My father, Jerry, still sends the occasional pathetic text message that pings on my new, restricted device, usually something vague and non-committal like, "Your mother is having a hard day," or "We should talk about the estate." But I never reply. I have deleted his contact information, leaving him as nothing more than a string of digits on a screen. A man who traded his child's soul for a quiet life with a tyrant and now has to live with the consequences of that bargain. Marcus and I are now living a life that is defined by the absence of permission. In our home, there are no journals being read in the dark, no socks being criticized for their lack of propriety, and no one is sent to bed hungry for the crime of being average. We live in a world where love is a constant, steady hum, like the engine of the 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe High Country that sits in our driveway, ready to take us toward a future they aren't invited to see. I still work the trauma shifts at Grady, and I still see the worst of what humans can do to one another. But when I walk through my own front door, the air is clean and the light is gold. I think back to the girl who used to wait for the sound of her father's footsteps on the stairs, hoping for a smuggled peanut butter sandwich to ease the hunger of a B+. And I realize that those sandwiches were never an act of love. They were an act of cowardice. They were the crumbs of a man who didn't have the courage to fix the table, so he fed his daughter in the dark to keep her quiet. I am done with sandwiches in the dark. I am eating at my own table now, a table I built with my own hands, paid for with my own wages, and filled with people who chose me when it cost them something to do so. The moral of my story is a hard, unyielding truth that many people spend their entire lives trying to avoid. Family is not a biological mandate. It is a behavioral contract. If the people who share your DNA are the ones who are most dedicated to your destruction, they have forfeited their right to your presence. My mother believed that because she gave me life, she owned the rights to its direction, but she forgot that a life, once given, belongs only to the person living it. She tried to cancel my wedding, my reputation, and my future, but all she succeeded in doing was canceling her own role in my story. I am Bethany Baker, and I am 31 years old, a trauma nurse who has seen the fragile line between life and death more times than I can count, and I know for a fact that you cannot save a patient who refuses to stop bleeding. My parents are the wound, and I have finally learned how to apply the tourniquet. The hyper-realism of my new life is a sensory delight. The specific, heavy click of the deadbolt I installed myself on our front door, the smell of the cedar shavings that Marcus brings home on his clothes, and the way the morning sun hits the lemon lavender cake topper we kept in our freezer as a trophy. These details are the technical specifications of my freedom. I have replaced the cloying scent of my mother's funeral peonies with the honest, earthy smell of a home that is actually lived in. My name is no longer a weapon to be used against me in the Millbrook social register. It is a signature on a mortgage, a badge on a set of scrubs, and a promise made to a man who saw me standing in an empty church and decided I was more than enough. The evidence folder remains on my hard drive, a digital insurance policy I hope I never have to use, but its presence is a reminder that the truth is a shield that can never be pierced by a $1.20 ballpoint pen. As I sit here today, I realize that the psychotic break my mother told everyone I had was actually just the moment I stopped being crazy enough to believe she loved me. I am finally, for the first time in my life, standing on my own 2 feet without looking over my shoulder for a disapproval that no longer has the power to reach me. I have built a life where the pews are always full of the right people, and where the only permission I need to be happy is my own. The aftermath wasn't a tragedy, it was a cleanup operation, a clearing of the wreckage to make room for the new construction. My father can keep his texts, and my mother can keep her Earl Grey and her Belgian linens. I have the fried chicken, the silk roses, and a man who loves me in the light of day. Real family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out and who helps you set the table when you finally decide you're worthy of a feast. I am Bethany Baker, and my table is full.